weeks ago, North Korea test-fired its most advanced missile, Hwasong-15, which it claims puts the entire U.S. within range. That action, of course, triggered a new level of frustration between the United States and North Korea. Amid heightened tensions between the two countries, UN Undersecretary-General for Political Affairs Jeffrey Feltman paid a visit to Pyongyang. This was called a rare visit because it's the first visit by a senior UN official in 7 years to North Korea. Plus, Feltman served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs during the Obama administration, making the visit more special. Previously, North Korean leadership stated that they could live for another 100 years under UN sanctions. But then why did they extend invitation to the United Nations? And what kind of role can UN play in the current situation? We'll delve into those questions on this week's Peninsula 24. As always, we are joined by two experts in the studio. To my left, first, Ambassador Joon was a former South Korean ambassador to the United Nations and currently teaching at the Kyung Hee University. Ambassador Oh, it's really good to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
And as always, to my right, Dr. Chang-su, Research Fellow Emeritus at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. Dr. Kim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and good to see you again.
So it seems like the United Nations is actively involving in the North Korean nuclear crisis issues. Undersecretary-General Jeffrey Feltman, he returned from his 4-day trip to North Korea on 9th, and it was the first visit by UN senior official in 7 years. So why did it take so long?
Well, probably it should have to do with the fact that the North Korean nuclear issue has been exacerbated over the last 7-8 years. They have conducted altogether 6 rounds of nuclear bomb tests. But it does not necessarily mean that there has not been any visit by UN officials to North Korea. Actually, in the area of humanitarian assistance, there have been some visits. For example, visit by the Executive Director of World Food Program 3 years ago. And last year, there was a visit by the President of IFRC, International Federation of Red Cross.
But not at the level of Undersecretary.
That's true, and not in the political area, mostly in the humanitarian area.
I see. Well, so it's been reported that North Korea has extended the invitation in September, as early as in September. So why they're doing it, and what's the intention behind that?
I think North Korea is trying to maintain its channel to the United Nations, not least because North Korea is getting humanitarian assistance from the United Nations every year. These days, it's usually in the amount of around $40 or $50 million. Used to be $100 million until 5 years ago, but they are, we don't have too many donors these days. The UN Secretary General is using what is called emergency fund to provide humanitarian assistance. So they need the United Nations.
I see. Well, the Feltman was a former diplomat. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs under Obama administration. And of course, he said that there's no intention to deliver a message from the United States and U.S. government to North Korea. But many people hoped for that. But he didn't get to see Kim Jong-un this time. I mean, Xi Jinping's envoy, special envoy, didn't get to see Kim Jong-un either. So is there anything that we can expect?
Because I think North Korea is not ready to talk with North Korea, even though they really want to talk to Washington. But Pyongyang says that we are not going to recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state because they have not shown their capability in many technical aspects. So they are not ready to talk to Washington. And even though they are ready to talk to, they want to talk to Seoul or Washington, but we refuse to talk to them. So they use whatever the channels they might provided by the United Nations. That's why I think it took me 5 years to invite this high senior official from the United Nations this time, and the United States is actually using this kind of channel, because whatever the channel they might develop to the Washington and Seoul, we have to capitalize on this channel. I think North Korea really wants to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state, but in doing so, they have to use some other kind of bypassing channel, which is the United Nations. I think this makes perfect sense for the North Korean leadership, that they begin to talk to the outside world, beginning with the United Nations, rather than talking directly to Washington or Seoul. But after all, this will lead to another big kind of meetings with Washington and Seoul in the years to come.
So it's a kind of easier first step to take.
I think so. Yeah,
I
sure.
see. Well, actually, after the visit, North Korean state media announced that two sides have agreed to communicate on a regular basis. It's kind of rare to, to reveal those, facts, what happened, and details of the agreement for the North Korean side. But what does it really mean?
Well, they didn't reveal much. What they basically said was that we decide to continue to talk to each other. Actually, they can always talk. They have their ambassador in New York, so they always have the so-called New York channel. But what we should take note of, I think, is the fact that they now decide to invite a high-ranking UN official dealing with political issues, including the sanctions against North Korea. So if they want to make a breakthrough, as hinted by Dr. Kim, I think that might be a signal. But I'm not too sure about it, yeah.
I see. So now the tension have been continuously escalated, and there are some voices from other countries than the United States and China and Japan, the so-called European countries. And it seems like, well, we can't just sit and wait and rely on those neighboring countries of Korea. And do you think those European countries can be of help or effective?
Well, European countries, of course, can play a role to a certain extent, but probably not as much as the countries that are directly involved, like China, United States, or Japan, or Russia. There was this process called the Six-Party Talks, which produced an agreement in 2005, which was a good deal, actually, but that was never implemented. So I think the countries that participated in the Six-Party Talks, these countries are the primary players here.
I think European countries they also have a very key players in world politics, and they have very high, stakeholders in this part of the world. And not only in this part of the world, but look at the Middle East and some other countries, they have already played in this very important negotiation with the United States, on the side of the United States. I think that's why Europeans, even they have different perceptions of North Korean threats, because we are facing very serious threats from North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the United States, and China as well. But their countries have a different perception of North Korean threats. That's why they might provide a new channel through which they can talk to North Koreans, because as I pointed earlier, in the United States, South Korea, and Japan, they still don't want to recognize North Korea as a kind of nuclear power state.
Well, besides the European countries, I actually feel the rise of another key player, which is Russia. Recently, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he said North Korea wants a direct talk with the United States. That Russia, along with China, was a little bit lukewarm about the UN sanction against North Korea. But can Russia play a significant role in this regard?
Actually, the Russian Federation has been waiting to play a very significant role many years to come, but they have been so kind of quiet and restive. But now they're forthcoming because of the new Eastern policy that have been advocated by Mr. Putin, and they're very adamant to propose this kind of new proposal to many countries in this part of the world, because they want to make the Vladivostok as the hub of the kind of energy and railroad kind of connections in this part of the world. So they are pretty much welcoming this kind of new initiative. And I think the Russian Federation will continue to play a much bigger role. At least this is their intention, that's their wishes. I don't know whether it will go as they wished. That's something we have to wait and see.
In addition to that, I think in the UN Security Council, they're dealing with so many issues and conflicts. And Russia, there are issues about which Russia is very much concerned and very much involved in, such as Syria. So I think, when I was in the UN, I felt that Russia always want to kind of maintain leverage on all issues the Security Council is dealing with. One of the most important one of which is, of course, the North Korean nuclear issue. So they want to maintain their voice. They want to maintain their leverage on North Korean issue.
Because it seems that Russia is making inroads to this issue recently. And I don't know, I mean, it's just my feeling, but Mr. Putin is putting a lot of effort in making the voices in the international community. And also, as long as it's countering the United States, that's actually good for the Russia. Am I a little bit too much putting an imagination in there?
Well, probably also because it looks like there is a little, problem in North Korea's relation with China, and it gives more room for Russia to play a role. Last month, there was a visit by the Russian delegation, a parliamentary delegation, to North Korea. And when they came back to Moscow, they said that North Koreans want to have a talk. As a nuclear weapon state, that condition is not acceptable.
Right.
But having a talk and going back to talks, I think will serve everyone's interest at this point.
Well, do they see any opportunity during the Trump presidency?
I think even the Trump administration in the United States would eventually like to have talks. Of course, the talks should be about denuclearization of North Korea. That was made clear by the United States, by Trump administration. But eventually, all the reason why we are putting so much pressure on North Korea is to bring North Korea back to denuclearization talks. I think that point is shared by everyone, including the Trump administration.
Yeah, because I'm seeing that maybe Russia is seeing any kind of opportunity that they can, maneuver the rooms to maneuver while the Trump is in the White House, because the U.S. is apparently backing up from a lot of international issues. So maybe Russia thought, well, this is time for us to make a voice and giving more presence in the global issues.
Whatever Russia's motive is, if they can bring North Korea back to the talks on denuclearization, I think we should give credit to Russia.
I see. Well, hopefully. And the South Korean government has imposed more sanctions, unilateral sanctions against North Korea, 20 North Korean firms and 12 individuals prior to the state visit to China. So what significance will these latest sanctions be?
I think the independent sanctions that have been that will be provided by the South Korean government will be a welcome sign for the United States and Russia and China as well. Even this kind of new proposal, this proposal has been repeated, has been already done by some other country like the United States and China. But I think this is a signal that we really mean business. We are not talking about just a dialogue away from the sanctions, because we believe we have to continue to press sanctions and pressure on North Korea until they come to a negotiating table. But on the other hand, we have to do something almost simultaneously, that is beginning to show they're willing to talk to you. So even though we at this time they bring another sanctions, our own independent sanctions by this government, that does not necessarily mean we will sever our dialogue or any talks or negotiating in the future forever. So I think this is a sign that we are willing to both. Just like the Trump administration, we are putting kind of much pressure, and also when the appropriate time comes, could enter into another phase of engagement with North Korea. So this shows that we are on the same page with the Trump administration, because there are so many people, particularly in the Washington area, that South Korea is not on the same page. We have a lot of disconnect between Washington and Seoul. But so this is a clear sign before he departs for Beijing and Chongqing that we are on the same page with Washington, but we also need the help from China. So I think this is a kind of dual signal to Beijing and Washington. They are willing to do both. On the one hand, we are going to continue to press on the North Korean leadership to eventually, dispose of nuclear weapons. But also in the meantime, you have to come to the negotiating table so that we can understand each other better, and we have to exchange our positions. So we're kind of paving a way for a future negotiation between Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang, and also including Beijing as well.
Well, I think, as Dr. Kim pointed out, it has a kind of a symbolic importance that we are taking unilateral sanctions. Not only we are in line with the international sanctions against North Korea, but also we are proactive. We are taking a lead in pressuring North Korea. The purpose of pressure, as I said, is to bring North Korea back to the talks, denuclearization talks. So that's a peaceful way of doing that, considering the alternative of using force to bring North Korea back to talks, Adding, strengthening sanctions is, under the circumstances, is the peaceful way of trying to find a solution to this issue.
I see. Well, there's going to be a South Korea and China summit pretty soon. So what do you see about the summit?
Minister Kang made the three so-called no's. Actually, this is a new thing. This has been the consistent policy of any previous Korean government, except the first one. Of course, we are not going to extend our security cooperation with Japan as a kind of formal security alliance of the three. That's something no. We have not talked about that kind of possibility yet. So it's nothing new. Not going to join the U.S.-led missile defense system. That's nothing new, because we have our KMD system, and we are also concerned about the legitimate concern by the Chinese leadership. So this is the second no, and third no is nothing new. But the first no is something that has been kind of stirred up a lot of debates here in South Korea, because some people call it, could we just abrogate our authority or independent rights to go for our own national security? But I think this is at least a minimum kind of negotiating card for our government before we talk to the Chinese leadership about the security of the Peninsula in particular, and also in particular the North Korea's nuclear issues. I think this is kind of pros and cons and gives and takes between Seoul and Beijing should be a kind of first stepping stone into a kind of further kind of security cooperation between China and South Korea. I think even though this Mr. Xi Jinping has a different idea and he has some other agenda as well, but I think our President Moon's visit to Beijing and also Chongqing will be very significant in making a kind of environment in which we can play a much China might play a bigger role in really calming down the tensions that have already risen here on the peninsula.
I see. Well, as a former high-ranking diplomat, how do you see the prospect of the China and Korea summit?
Usually when you have this kind of diplomatic summit, things are usually worked out in advance.
Right. It's hard to fail, basically.
Yeah. So I don't think we will see any surprise at this summit. But when it comes to the possibility of North Korea's freeze on its weapons development, I think that will be meaningful only in the sense that that will give room for the players to go back to the talks, dialogue. because as long as North Korea keeps firing missiles and testing bombs, we cannot have talks, even talks. So that will give chance for everyone to go back to talks. But that a freeze would not mean much in the context of weapons development itself, because the way I see it, North Korea has almost achieved what it wants in terms of weapons capabilities. So a freeze at this stage is, it might be interpreted as a completion of their capability, not, stopping somewhere.
I see. Well, I think very important issue here, the summit, is because the sentiment of people of two countries has aggravated due to those issues of THAAD deployment. Do you think the summit can amend those damaged relations? Maybe it's at the official level it is fine, but at the level of people, the public sentiment toward each other, do you think it will be an improvement?
I think so. I think both sides realize that the relation between China and South Korea should not be kind of hijacked by the North Korean issue. North Korean issue is important, but we have many other important activities between the two countries, including, of course, the trade and economic issues. After all, the South Korea and China are the largest trading partner, especially from our perspective. And, we should move on. The relationship should be future-oriented.
I see. Well, North Korea said they could live under sanctions for another 100 years. Of course, I don't really believe that. It seems like you're bluffing. But does it mean that the sanction is not really effective, or is not enough?
They must endure for another 100 years if people can live minimum requirements, minimum necessity in life. And I think nobody can do that in today's world. This is a world that is being globalized very fast. Even people in North Korea, our sisters and brothers in North Korea, they probably know what is happening in China, what is happening in South Korea. So they cannot live with minimum necessities. North Korean leadership should give their own people better life at a certain stage. And at a certain stage is not very remote future, in my opinion, quite soon. So they cannot go on another 100 years if we consider all of this.
I see. The U.S. actually dismissed the prospect of talks with North Korea, even though North Korea now seems to want it, unless it denuclearize all their nuclear programs. And also the U.S. has said that the North Korea has brought the world closer to war. And then now the international community and the UN and other countries, like Russia, is jumping into, in the North Korea's nuclear crisis. Do you think it will be solved by the other countries or other players than the United States? Of course, it's a really difficult question, but...
Yeah, this is a very long-worded question, and depending on how you define the North Korean nuclear issue, and more in general, like a North Korean issue in general. I think it's been a very long issue, and unless we deal with the long historical issues of division and the military conflict between North Korea and South Korea, it will be very difficult for any country, single country, to solve. So this is a combination of all international efforts to help, chip in helping all this resolve this North Korean issue, including some help stretched out to the North Korean leadership in a way to invite them and induce them to the negotiating tables so that they can find this is actually in their best interest to come to the negotiating table while maintaining their nuclear capability along the side. So there's a kind of, I think it's very conceptually speaking, they find kind of conceptual time is coming for the North Korean leadership to come to the negotiating table.
Okay, well, what do you think, Ambassador Oh, reflecting your past experience at UN, is the coordinated effort by the international community, is it effective? And it does have any meaningful influence?
Well, coordinated efforts by the international community are important in the sense that we need to strengthen pressure and sanctions against North Korea until they come back to the talks on denuclearization. You know, when you said that U.S. Is not interested in talking to North Korea unless they denuclearize, I think what they exactly mean by that is that they will not talk to North Korea unless the talk is about denuclearizing North Korea. So that we all agree, and in inducing North Korea to do that, to come back to the talks, we need sanctions, we need pressure. So in applying pressure, the coordinated efforts by the international community are extremely important.
I see. All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insights. And thank you all for staying with us. We'll be back next week with the hottest issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Thanks for watching.